Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our today's session. Mr. Luke Devirgiliis from US will be presenting today. As was shared before, the topic is constraint in coaching. Mr. Luke is a PhD student pursuing his PhD studies at University of Tennessee. So let me not take much of his time or your time and give him this opportunity to present to us this afternoon. Luke, welcome.
Thanks, John. So yeah, I'm gonna just dive right in here. A quick presentation I'm gonna bring up. Okay, great. Yeah, so again, my name is Luke Devirgiliis. I am a PhD student. Actually, Dr. Pierce's professor was one of my professors as well. He's my current chair of my dissertation committee, and Dr. Pierce is on my dissertation. So there's a bunch of connections there, and that's kind of how I got in touch with everyone here. But anyway, I'm just going to jump right in. We're going to talk about constraint-based coaching today. And what that's going to be is applying some kind of constraint to either our sport or some movement in the sport. And we're going to kind of follow this progression throughout the presentation. First off, what does applying a constraint look like? Secondly, we're going to talk about why applying a constraint could benefit a coach. Third, we're going to talk about how we can apply constraints. We will look into some ideas in the weight room, in individual or team sports. We're going to talk about some drawbacks or potential concerns with it. And then finally, we'll have time to talk about it as a group if we're interested. So what does applying a constraint look like? We're going to kind of separate it into two different ways of constraining the actual modality. So we can either constrain or enhance. For the purpose of this talk, we'll call them both constraints. But either one could be limiting the range of motion or enhancing a portion of the movement. We can do this by adjusting the field of play, altering the implements that we're using, or potentially changing the loading. So some examples for some constraints. If we have like a soccer team, we can change the size of the pitch that they play on, and that's going to change the way that they behave inside of the actual pitch and the parameters, that they're going to change direction more or potentially go slower. If we have a sprinter, we can do some form of resistant sprinting. That constraint should change their mechanics and should also allow them to field a little differently. In terms of enhancements, we could do things like if you're a jumps coach in track and field, we often have people do high jumps off of boxes where it's going to elevate them slightly and allow them more time to work on their mechanics in the air. Could do the same thing with long jump, could do the same kind of process with like an overspeed sprint. And those types of things will allow us to kind of touch on the more difficult parts of the movement that take a very short period of time, that we don't get as much work if we're doing the full-fledged movement. So we're going to look at a quick example here. These two videos, this is actually my intern from 2 years ago. His name's Cameron, and he was a skeleton athlete. So he was pushing sleds a lot. So we're going to look at a sprint here on the left of Cameron. And then we're going to look on the right here at a sled-resisted sprint. Same thing. Go through each of those one more time. Try to get them kind of moving at the same time here. And what you can see with Cam here is that when we give him that constraint of putting a sled in front of him, giving him a heavy object to push, it's going to allow him to emphasize the driving or acceleration mechanics. And it's going to kind of slow him down. It's going to slow the entire movement down and allow him that time to feel those acceleration angles and mechanics. You can see that as he's taking off in the beginning of that sprint in the first video, he's getting that really aggressive drive angle. And then we kind of have the same thing happening. This one's a little bit more exaggerated, but as he's pushing the sled, he's able to keep that same kind of angle, and we're able to emphasize that earlier part of the movement. And that's going to be kind of this main overarching theme, is that we're going to take a movement and emphasize different parts of it. We're allowing us to give the athlete some kind of external feedback and to take more time in certain portions of the movement and to really work on those. And we'll see that there can be some physiological changes to that, but at the same time, it makes coaching way simpler. And it's a really good way of kind of just organizing the way we think about coaching and what we can do with it. So again, to reiterate how we're going to look at the two constraints enhancements, we're either going to put like a limitation on our movement, our practice, or our game, or we're going to enhance it and make it easier for the movement, practice, or game. We do have to be aware that this is going to take away some major components. If you're pushing a sled, you're not going to reach the same top speed mechanics that you are when you're doing a free sprint. But in essence, we are attempting to simplify the movement and to make it more easy to coach. So why are we doing this? What is this going to do for us? Well, first off, it allows us to focus on the athlete's weaknesses. It's going to potentially increase the output of like a target physiological variable. Could be something like rate of force development, force production. We're able to mimic kind of a high intensity competition environment, but maybe with a little bit of lower loading. So if we look again at Cameron's sprints there, he's able to push that sled. He's able to get those very aggressive drive angles, but I don't have to put him on the track and have him do 100 or a 60-meter repeat where he's going to put his hamstrings in a ton of fatigue and he's going to be in a pretty beat up state. And then again, it's going to improve my ability to coach a certain portion of the movement or a certain portion of my game. Particularly with that sprinting example, again, we're focusing on that drive, that acceleration phase. So how can we apply constraints? The first thing to do, and this is probably a general rule of thumb with any of these things, is we can conduct a needs analysis. And we're going to kind of look at that in 3 factors. So first, we're going to conduct the needs analysis for just the sport. So we're going to say, what is the energy system the sport needs? What are the key variables? And then what are my technical components that I want to emphasize and that I want to focus on? We'll go into some examples in a little bit here. We'll then look at the coach needs analysis, which is going to tell us what kind of tactics does the coach like to use? What is the style of play of the team? And then we'll do the athlete needs analysis, which will give us an idea of the deficiencies of the athletes, the strengths of the athletes, whether or not we have technical sound proficiency or something along those lines. So to give an example, we're going to start with weightlifting. It is one of the more pure output sports. It's going to really give us an idea of how we can apply this concept and look at the physiological adaptations to it. So if we do a needs analysis for weightlifting, we'll just go through kind of a random example here. We'll say a weightlifter is going to be utilizing that phosphocreatine system. They're going to be high output, very high rate of force development, and they need to be technically sound in the snatch and the clean and jerk. If we're going to then look at the coach analysis side, this is probably not as relevant for a sport like weightlifting, but we can think about whether or not an athlete is going to utilize certain techniques here. For instance, do they do the squat jerk? Do they do the split jerk? If you were in a sport like track and field, you could say, okay, did they throw the shot with a glide technique or with a rotational technique? And this might become more relevant with certain individual sports like wrestling or judo, where we have to consider what kind of technique do they emphasize. Is this a lighter weight class athlete who really likes to do single legs and low ankle picks? Or is this one of our big athletes that is always using hip throws and foot sweeps, things like that, which could affect the way that we're going to kind of apply constraints. And then after that step, we'll go and do a athlete-based needs analysis. And we're going to say, where is this athlete weak? Where are they strong? And what are their particular technical issues? So maybe we can say, oh, this weightlifter isn't very strong in the pull, or they aren't very strong overhead, but they are very explosive. They're able to develop force very rapidly, even if it's not a lot of force. And then what kind of technical issues do they have? Do they have a poor finish? They're not able to drive the bar to the ceiling well. They can't really save lifts. And then based off of what we found from those 3 categories, we can start to apply constraints to the training. An example of some constraints we can apply is attempting to alter force production, attempting to simplify lifts into partial ranges of motion, and constraints that are going to stop the athlete's ability to make specific errors that we notice in their training. So if we see those technical deficiencies, then we can say, okay, let's put a constraint on there that's going to stop them from being able to do that. So some examples here. Let's say we want to get that altered force production. We want them to be just a little bit stronger. So we'll do some heavier pulls. We'll do some squats, things like that, which are portions of the movement. So this is kind of a normal part of training. This is the same thing that probably, if you've ever trained a weightlifter, you've expected to do heavy pulls and squats. But we are, in fact, applying a constraint to what we're actually doing. And we know that that's going to create a change in our force production and our rate of force production. Now, if we want to focus more on those technical components, then we can look at doing certain portions of the movement from blocks. So we could do cleans or snatches from the blocks, which we know are going to emphasize speed under the bar. And then at the same time, they're going to really emphasize those finishing mechanics because they start to take away that first portion of the movement, right? We take away the first pull or the second pull of the clean, and we put the athlete on blocks, and they just focus on that finish. It gives them the training opportunity and gives you, the coach, the coaching opportunity to say, okay, we are going to make a manipulation here, and we're going to really focus in on this one region, and it enhances your ability to coach that. Some parts that we can do that will limit errors, something like a no brush snatch, a no foot snatch, or a jerk with no counter movement. Things like that, if we say you're not allowed to touch your hips with the barbell when you're doing a snatch, you're going to have to keep that bar close. It's the only way to keep and maintain the trajectory. And that should enhance the finish, should allow us to keep the athlete in roughly the same place. And again, we can do that with a no foot movement or something similar with a concentric only jerk, something along those lines. So we're going to go through a couple more videos here. You might recognize the athlete in these. So what's going on in the background here is the live force time data from the actual pull that we did. I know it's pretty tough to see, but the next slide will have each of those going on at the same time. So I'm going to run through each of these. So we're going to have a clean from the floor, and then we're going to have a clean from below the knee and a clean from above the knee. And again, I'm going to pull up that live force data here. So it's not going to be super important that we remember that, but we just wanted to get a picture of what each of those actually looked like. So when we're looking at a clean from the floor, and then a clean from above the knee, clean from below the knee, right? We are applying increasing levels of a singular constraint, right? We're limiting the range of motion of that first technical execution of the clean, which started out from the floor, and then we're kind of bumping it up to below the knee, above the knee. And we can see on the right here, the actual live force data that came from our force plates when we ran this. We started each of the movements. This is just the one trial, but we started each of the movements roughly a second before this increase, this change in slope of the line, which is when the athlete started to pull. You can see a little orange dot at the top of these. That is going to be the peak force. So that's when the force plate said that this was, this was our maximum here. So if you look at the first one, this is our clean pull from the floor. And you can kind of follow along here. This is just kind of an empty time. Then we have the start of the pull. This dip here is when the athlete goes into the double knee bend. And then we have that power position, that final pull. We have an unweighting phase, and then the catch and stand up. And that's going to be the same thing here with below the knee. We have that initial pull, double knee bend, the power position, unweighting and catch. And then the same thing with the third one, but because we're starting above the knee, that double knee bend is much less exaggerated. So the way that the force changes is going to be much more abrupt and much more rapid. Now, if you look at these boxes, those are about the same time across all these. It's going to take a lot less time for us to go from a clean pull from the floor, a full clean from the floor, to going above the knee, and both of those getting to that power position, getting to the end of the most explosive portion of the lift. So what you'll notice here is I have kind of our our time-based variables here on the right, and then our force variables on the left. And that position here that you see at the bottom is roughly the power position. It might be a second or two late. But if that is our power position, that's where we're eventually going. We know that's where peak force is. Then we know that as I move that bar higher to that position, the athlete is going to have to develop peak force much faster. So we're going to see really high rates of force development and very abrupt pulls, and we're going to very emphasize those types of things as we move those blocks higher. As we bring them closer to the ground, the movement's going to become a little bit less similar to that, and we're going to see more of that double knee bend, and we're going to see more of what happens in the actual competition. Now, if you look on the right here, so we have, again, the peak force, and we'll start with trial 1 from the floor, and then we move our way to above knee and below knee, and you'll notice that it's not very different, right? 100 newtons, that's 10 kilos, right? It's not a very big difference here. But if we look at the time to peak force, we notice that it starts to get smaller and smaller once we go from the floor to above the knee and then below the knee, which tells us that the athlete is having to develop that force in a much shorter span of time, which could be a favorable adaptation for us, could be something we're not super interested in. And because that force is going to be multiplied by time to create the concept of impulse, and it's going to be a lot of the impulse that's lifting the bar, then we'll notice that the impulse here on the left is going to be moving negatively as we increase the height of the bar, which makes sense. We're not pulling on it as far. We are not getting as much time to exert force, so the impulse, the total impulse, is going to be lower. That makes sense. But what we can expect from that is that as we approach that below knee, or excuse me, as we get to the above knee position, we're going to see a change, and we're going to see the athletes start to have to produce force faster. So what does this tell us? Why is this useful for us? Well, there's 3 ways to look at this, right? If we're going off of these higher blocks, the above knee blocks, we're going to see a high rate of force development, and we're going to exaggerate from the coaching perspective speed under the bar for the athlete, and then also that aggressive upper body finish and the big shrug and that big triple extension that comes from the ankles, knees, and hips. However, we do this at the cost of losing the double knee bend and losing those knee positions that are going to be vital for someone who's learning how to lift or someone who's practicing pulling off the floor. And then we also lose that first pull that comes off the floor. Now, if we go off the blocks in the middle, which are going to be below the knee, we're going to see a moderate rate of force development. We're going to emphasize speed under the bar. We still have to exaggerate that finish, and we get to kind of include the double knee bend in this movement while cutting out the first pull. So we're kind of reaching the middle there, where that's not going to be maybe as exaggerated of those variables or coaching points as when we went off the high blocks, but it's going to be still a little bit farther away from what we do in competition. And then if we go off the floor, that is the competition movement. That's the most specific we can get. We're going to have the greatest range of motion, which also means that we're probably going to have the most fatigue because we're putting the muscles through the greatest length that they're going to change. And then in this case, we can typically lift the most weight because impulse is going to drive how much I can lift that bar. And because the impulse is going to be the highest when I pull off the floor, then we should expect that there's going to be the most weight on the bar when I'm pulling off the floor. Now, it is usually, there are some people, myself included, that are very fast off the blocks, and they'll probably feel more comfortable going like that way. We're the people that are not maybe the best at pulling off the floor. So that's something to be aware of, is that if you create a constraint that tends to emphasize the athlete's strengths rather than their weaknesses, they might be better at that than if it were the complete movement. So we're going to take a quick look at some field-based perspective here. So if we're thinking about soccer or football, we'll do that sports needs analysis. We're going to be more in that like lactic system. We're going to be more in that oxidative system. We know from some GPS data that we could be running anywhere from 8 to 12 kilometers. Could be a ton of distance built up. We have to have those endurance components. We are going to see some high-speed running. We are going to see a lot of change in accelerations, a change in the torso angle that's going to facilitate that. And then we need to have good ball skills. We need to be able to dribble, need to be able to pass, need to be able to shoot, all the technical components of soccer that everyone's familiar with. When we take this to a coach needs analysis, this is where it gets kind of interesting, because the American system, if you come to like an American soccer or football kind of college, it's a much faster rate of play because of the way that the subs work. So because they can make more substitutions and more players can come in and out, we'll notice that the rate of play is faster, the high speed running might be higher, but there's likely a little bit less technical ball work. And that just comes probably from the nature of the way that we play soccer in this country and the emphasis that it has as a youth sport. Whereas in the European system, people tend to be much more technically sound. They spend more time with the ball, and they are likely running less because of the substitutions. They're not reaching as high speeds. It might be more fatiguing, more time per individual spent in the game. And then finally, if we look at the athlete needs analysis from here, what are their deficiencies? What are their strengths? What are their technical issues? So maybe we have a slow athlete that can't build up high speed. Maybe we have an athlete that is slow but able to run forever. They can run down the ball all day. Or we have someone who has some technical issues or proficiencies with the ball. So they're not great at passing. They're not great at dribbling. And those kind of things we'll have to keep track of when we think about how we're going to kind of apply some constraints. So something that we can do with soccer is we can manipulate the size of the pitch during a small-sided game. We can manipulate the number of players in the game, or we can utilize drills that are going to emulate particular plays or moments in the game. So for instance, some things we could do is we could do a larger pitch, which is going to increase the amount of aerobic endurance. We're going to take people out into that more aerobic system. And then we're also giving them more time to develop speed in their sprints. So if they are able to run down the ball, or if they have the ball, we should see them getting greater acceleration and hitting greater top speeds. We can reduce the size of the pitch, which is going to mean more change of direction. It's going to mean more accelerations, and everything will happen at a faster pace. We can kind of do a similar manipulation by putting more or less players in the game. So if we have a small-sided game, say it's 5-on-5 with a keeper on each side, we can bump that up to 6-and-6 in the same size pitch. And that's going to mean we have more passing, more change of direction. Or we can take some players out, which means more players will have time working with the ball, and we'll have more high-speed running. We have more space to spread out, more time to accelerate, and we'll reach a higher top speed. There's some other things we can do by utilizing drills that are going to have specific adaptations. So we can do something like long passing patterns. So if these are passing and scoring, or just long passes, this is going to improve that top speed, right? And this allows us to stay kind of within the parameters of the game, instead of saying, okay, we're going to take 5 or 6 people and we're just going to make you do sprints all day, and we're going to make you do long, slow stuff. We can get them to do their top speed work inside of a passing pattern, which keeps that kind of technical element of the game. We can do something like a rondo or a possession drill, which is going to have a lot of change of direction and should improve the technical or tactical component, because we can work on defense, we can work on taking possession of the ball or closing on lost possession. And then at the same time, those defensive players are going to be spinning around, changing direction, having to accelerate a lot more. Now, some drawbacks to the constraint-based approach. We obviously don't do this in competition, right? If you're great off the blocks, that's fantastic, but unfortunately, you don't get to bring them out to the competition platform and set them up before you lift. So we need to make an effort to make a connection between our competition movement and then whatever constraint we've used. So if we're doing all of our work from the blocks, if we're doing it all from the mid-thigh position or the power position, we need to still have connecting exercises and blocks that are going to tell the athlete, okay, we've done this movement in this way, but we have to tie it back into what you're actually going to do in competition. It's the same kind of thing with the field approach. It could be the same kind of thing with an individual sport. we're using heavy or light implements in a throw or something like that, or if we're taking soccer players and we're pulling out players so that they can get those high speed running distances in, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to improve their performance unless we can tie that into what they're actually going to do in the game. And we're also going to de-emphasize some important variables that take place during the competition. So what we do with this is really take a single block or a single large period of time and we emphasize a certain portion of a movement. And by doing so, we're going to reduce the amount of emphasis on some other critical components. So for instance, again, if we have someone sprinting with sleds all the time, we're going to really emphasize their acceleration movements. We're going to emphasize those drive patterns. But at the same time, that might come at the sacrifice of losing their top speed mechanics. And if we let them get too good at accelerating, and they get really fast, and they can build up speed really well, but then they hit those top speed mechanics, it might potentially lead to like an increased injury risk down the road where they've built up a lot of speed that their hamstring isn't quite able to handle. That could potentially be an injury risk, or it could potentially just mean that we're not going to hit that maximum performance that we want to. So we have to consider where we're placing these kind of things, where inside that competition schedule, inside that annual plan, and where everything lines up with our major competitions. And then some final thoughts and kind of some big benefits to this. The biggest thing that this does is it simplifies the coaching process. We can prescribe based off of weaknesses, and we can cue with an exercise instead of just with our words, right? So if I know I have an athlete who really just isn't getting their sprint mechanics down, they just can't quite get that torso angle. If I have them run with a sled, I know what's going to happen. I know they're going to have a more aggressive torso angle. So it allows me to work with an athlete, either even remotely potentially, or if I have a large group of people, I know I can get that adaptation that I want by programming it into the exercise. And I can kind of coach through my programming instead of just saying, okay, we're going to take this group and I'm going to yell at all of them to lean forward and to fall more, and potentially having to know those right perfect cues for each individual person is going to be a lot harder than finding the actual exercise or programming that's going to get them into the position that you want to. And at the same time, like we mentioned before, this allows us to keep a very high intensity for certain portions of the movement while reducing the overall loading. So again, we can do those sprints with the sled resisted. We're going to see those acceleration mechanics, but then at the same time, we don't have to go through 10 to 15 high intensity 100-meter sprint efforts, which could cause a ton of fatigue down the road. And maybe we're checked out for the next 2 or 3 training days because we're so beat up from doing these high intensity sprints. So I have a couple of references here that are worth looking into. Some on how to do a needs analysis, some things on resisted sprints, and then finally, a couple of things talking about comparison of weightlifting variables before, after, changing heights, going up from the floor up to like the mid-thigh position. These do focus particularly on pulls. However, there are a few that can kind of dig into what the actual clean looks like and how it looks if you turn the bar over and so on and so forth. These do take more of a physiological perspective. And I think I kind of took more of a coaching perspective from this presentation, but I think there's something to be considered for both of those. All right, and I believe that is the rest of that presentation there. If anyone has any questions or discussion, I can read these questions here. Can we use a wall as a constraint where there's no sled? You could, yes. The only thing, if you were to use a wall, is you have to consider that it's going to get you even farther and farther away from the competition movement. So if you don't have a sled, something like even a band, where if you can get a big, thick resistance band, and that can be behind the athlete, wrapped around their waist, and then the coach can, or another athlete could even pull on them and let them run with it. We'll get more specificity towards that competition movement, which would allow us probably a little bit more of a better stimulus. I would use the wall definitely in those early phases when I'm trying to teach drive mechanics and things like that. If anyone else has any questions, weightlifting, what specific movement can you use to get from the bottom position during a clean? Would that be clean from above knee? Are there any exercises? Could you elaborate what you mean bottom position, meaning the first pull from the floor or from the bottom of the squat?
From the bottom of the squat.
Yeah, great question. So there's two ways to look at that. The first one is, are we strong enough to get out of the squat in general, right? If the athlete is strong enough that they can just stand up, we've kind of emphasized those front squats. If they're not necessarily strong enough to get out of the squat, we have to think about whether or not they have the correct mechanics pulling under the bar and whether they're in a favorable position when they receive the bar. If we look at those force time graphs, we're going to see almost as much, not quite as much, but almost as much force in the pull as we do in the catch of the clean. And it's important to note that the pull is obviously a much more favorable biomechanical position for us to produce force than being at the very bottom of the clean. So it's going to be something where if we do those kind of like high block movements, we're able to emphasize just really that extension into the turnover and then the bottom of the catch. And it can allow someone to work on their posture, to work on their positioning when they catch the bar, and then also get that front squat without having to necessarily work on the bottom part of the pull, which could be pretty fatiguing. Like it's low back could be involved in that. So there's no substitute for being strong. If you have a huge front squat, you're probably able to stand up most of your cleans. But at the same time, if you are able to do a lot of cleans off higher blocks or cleans from the hang in the mid-thigh position, something like that, power position, right above the knee hang, those kind of things will allow us to sort of emphasize that side of the movement. You're welcome.
All right. Any more questions for Luke or any clarification? So Luke, this is more of an analysis approach of conducting trainings.
Mhm.
It's more of coming up with a strategy that can work on the weaknesses, either as an individual or as a team.
Yes,
So it's
absolutely.
not, yeah, so it's not more of the daily drills, but actually trying to get and understand what the team needs.
Right. And it definitely plays in and can be very valuable for people that are not able to be with those athletes every day. So especially if it's something where you have like off-season training where you know the athletes aren't going to be with you, you know what adaptation you want, you can run your needs analysis, you can think about what variables that's going to hit, and then you can kind of build off there.
Yeah. So guys, any question for Luke or any clarification?
I thought that was a wonderful talk. It was well presented there.
Thanks, Dr. Pierce. I appreciate that.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Reading this comment here. Glad to use weightlifting as an example. We're experiencing a lot of burnout athletes. I believe they are struggling because we don't give them all the necessary technical know-hows. Yeah, I think that is a big thing, especially when it comes to programming weightlifting. It's very easy to also think like, I want to do a lot of squats. I want to do a lot of pulls because I know those are going to make the athlete stronger. Or I want to do all the competition movement because I know that that's exactly what I'm trying to get. But it's nice to be able to make those modifications and to introduce variation that will both maybe eliminate some of that fatigue and eliminate some of that monotony. And then at the same time, we can keep that specificity pretty high and pretty similar to the movement. And remember, like we get into weightlifting. I'm a weightlifter myself, got into this sport because I want to turn a bar over and I want to do snatches and cleans and jerks. And that's always really exciting to do. So it takes away some of that monotony from doing squats or pulls or those kind of things all the time. And just kind of keeps keeps a good connection to the sport. I think it'll be very helpful if you try to apply.
It's a comment.
Thank you.
However, we are trying to get questions at the moment so that we exploit Luke's time. We may not be able to get him again. So if there's anyone with anything that they would like Mr. Luke to expound on or just to clarify, this is the time. In any sport.
Yes, I have one.
Kindly.
Yes, I have one for clarifications.
Go ahead.
On my side, he talked about drills, not to do many drills. So maybe I didn't understand well. He could clarify for that drills, because sprinters normally they do a lot of drills to enhance their speed, and maybe let him clarify about drills. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I am a huge fan of drills. I think you should be doing a ton of them. This is definitely something that is a way of looking at changing how you were to do one session or 2 sessions per week that incorporate as much specificity as possible to what you're actually doing. So this isn't going to ever replace, all your mechanical work. All these things all have to happen at the same time. But this does allow you to emphasize or de-emphasize certain components. So probably the way I would set something up similar to this for a sprinter is when we're in those earlier phases and I want to work on those driving mechanics, I might take one of my sprint sessions a week that's going to be more sled focused. And that session's probably still going to start with drills. And then we're going to get into kind of our sled work and our acceleration work. And then there's still going to be something tied in there to work out going from the sled into a full movement that's going to allow the athlete to kind of still retain that connection to the actual sport.
Okay, thank you.
I can see, there's one. Look, there's one on the chat
Okay.
board.
Could you please clarify speed and pulls? How should one exert a pull to go in line with the speed needed? And we're talking about weightlifting there, correct? Yeah, because we talked about weightlifting before. So the probably one of the most important things that will define how we lift a bar is the ability to accelerate it. Acceleration of the bar is going, particularly at those key points at that power position and so on, is going to dictate how well we lift the bar. So I would say, especially if we're going off of blocks or something like that, we are always going to be trying to hit our maximum speed, and we're going to be trying to produce as much force as possible. As we change the position of the boxes or whatever that constraint might be, if we're doing this from the hang, so we're going from a high hang to a low and then to the floor, we are going to change the speed needed to get under the bar. Because as we improve that impulse, or we increase that impulse, if we're going lower to the ground, we have more time to develop force. There's going to be more total force imparted to that, or more total impulse imparted to that bar. So it should go a little bit higher. That's why we can typically do more off the floor than we can from blocks below or above the knee. So in that case, we are going to emphasize speed under the bar. So there's kind of 2 different ways to think about speed. Is it how fast is the bar moving? And then once the bar has kind of reached that top height and the athlete is no longer pushing into the ground, how fast is the athlete moving under the bar? And we can look at that by looking at the athlete's center of mass and looking at how quickly it gets under, how long that takes. That's actually something that Dr. Pierce and I are going to look at in my dissertation. But what we can do here is, if we are doing a pull from those top positions, we're probably going to see a net higher speed, like that average speed is going to be higher. Whereas as we get lower to the ground, we're going to see the speed start to drop off a little bit, the average, but hopefully because we're very forcible, we'll still see those peak speeds of the bar kind of at the top end once we hit that power position. Does that help answer the question?
Yes, you did. Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course.
Wow.
Yeah, look, could you, on basketball, for example, I can see we have a few basketball coaches here.
Mhm.
On basketball, for example, you want to, there's this new version of 3x3 aside,
Mhm.
where they play three players at any given time. So there are 6 in the court. So for you to like improve their work rate, do you think you can do more athletes or less athletes?
Yeah, so something you could do there to actually kind of steal from soccer is you could do like one of the things that they'll do in soccer or football is like 1 defensive player and 2 offensive players. So it could be, okay, I have 2 athletes that progress forward and almost attack. So they go to play, they try to score, and then you have 3 athletes that defend. So that would be kind of like a zone-based thing. If you're doing a man-to-man approach, that would kind of change the way that things work. But if you look at what happens with like a one-on-one game, obviously the player who has a ball is going to spend the most time with the ball, right? They'll spend 50% of the time of the possession time with the ball. So if you increase the number of players, we reduce the amount of possession time to the point where we're going to start increasing passing, and we're going to start increasing probably the chance of shooting, and there'll be less drives to the basket because those individuals have less defenders to get around, or have more defenders to get around, so they're less likely to drive. So if we were to back out players from that, and we were to do a small game that has fewer players or players that are kind of assigned to a specific role, then we could see that maybe we'll increase those work rates. And that would be, again, a way to get that technical practice in, potentially to focus on either defending or driving to the basket, something like that, or technical passing, certain pick and roll type situations, without necessarily having to just say, okay, we got some basketball guys, they're not in great shape, they need to be better, let's hit some sprints, those kind of things. I mean, a team environment is more mental programming as we shift variables and cues. Weightlifting seems more physical. I would say it could actually go either way. That's a great question, but in a team environment, you can certainly manipulate some of the physical variables. If we had GPS data here, which we do take GPS data with our soccer team, but that's kind of all protected by our institutional review board. So I didn't put any of that in this presentation. But if we do take some GPS data and we say, okay, let's put more people into this, or take people out of this pitch, let's make the pitch longer, we will see high-speed running distances go up, max velocity goes up, the possession time with the ball will go up if we have longer distances or less people, and we'll see the opposite if we do the same thing, increase the people, reduce the size of the pitch. So it kind of depends on how you look at those variables, but at the same time, it is going to have on both sides of it that mental programming. It is coaching in the end, right? So we are using these constraints to allow us to coach better, because there's many different ways we can improve force or RFD or high-speed running, top speed, those kinds of things, other than just saying, hey, let's go in and hit sprints, let's go hit squats, pulls, things like that. So it does allow us to kind of have that mental side of coaching, as well as being actually like having the physiological and physical changes.
All right. Any more concerns from Mr. Luke? Mr. Paul, are you with us? Mr. Paul, are you? All right. If we do not have any more questions or concerns for Mr. Luke. Let me take this opportunity to thank him and also thank you guys for attending. And just hope to have another session with Mr. Luke in the coming future.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be wonderful. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Luke, for your time, and we appreciate everything. I believe everybody has really learned a lot, and as you can see from the comments, it's a new thing in terms of developing a coaching approach. Yeah, it makes coaches now more active and more participatory in terms of the output of the athletes or the team. Right. So thank you so much. I know you are heading to work or you're already at work. We only scheduled
here,
for
yeah.
So we wouldn't like to keep you more. Otherwise, thank you so much for your time. And
Absolutely.
have a great day. Yeah.
Yeah, feel free to send anyone my way if they have any questions or if they need to see any of those references or anything.
Sure.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.